if anybody else crawls in, but if not, thank you guys for coming. So the three of us will be presenting. I'm Eric Patterson. A few of you know me, and I know you guys. So again, thanks for coming. I'm a director for Digital Production Arts graduate program at Clemson University, and also associate professor in the Visual Computing Research Division. I've had some short-term residencies at Red Storm Ubisoft and Sony Pictures Imageworks, and done a variety of other consulting and things along the way. And these guys, Jessica Barron and Sean Lee, will be presenting with me. Jessica has already interned at Weta FX. It was Weta Digital at the time, and Pixar RenderMan and Epic Games, and also just got back from a Fulbright in Switzerland. And Sean Lee is interned also at USC Institute of Creative Technologies and is about to head off to DreamWorks for the character effects department for the summer. Both these guys are working on their PhD with me at Clemson University. So what we're going to talk about today is this light sphere that you see Stephanie sitting in right here. And this is inspired by something called a light stage that was developed out at University of Southern California Institute of Creative Technologies first. And we'll give you a little bit of glimpse of what its purpose is, but then also at the other purposes that we're sort of making ours unique by doing a little extra add-on. So here's the final sort of product, so you can sort of see what we're talking about, and also the inside joke in the title of somebody actually getting inside of there. There is a door on the right side, which you can't see by looking at the geodesic grid. But this is an array of 364 red, green, blue, white LED lights that we can individually control the intensities and the color ratios, so we can create virtually any light field condition inside of the sphere. So we can replicate certain lighting environments, and we can control the lighting one light at a time for directional lighting and other conditions that you'll see a little bit about in our talk. So a little bit about how I got interested in this sort of thing. I've done face work for quite a long time on both research and graphics side. Done some DoD grants for biometrics and face age progression long before all this silly deep fake stuff of the past few years. And so one of the things that always kind of upset me about the equipment, and a lot of good 3D scanning equipment has come out, is that the color map, the texture map that's captured with the devices, even these really expensive $300,000 3D MD devices, the texture map is pretty sad. It's this bad 8-bit RGB color map with shiny specular highlights because of flash lighting and all this sort of thing. So I got interested in the light stage as it was being developed, and a fellow named Paul Devovec, he left ICT a few years back, and he's actually heading up the new R&D division at Netflix right now. Developed this, and it was kind of built in tandem, and it got picked up by the production industry, so it's been used a lot in face scanning for film work, high-end visual effects work. So one of the very first films that used this was the Spider-Man production, Spider-Man 2 with Alfred Molina as Doc Ock, and it was the first film that had a close-up digital human face in it. That final scene as Doc Ock falls back into the fire was completely rendered. And one of the things that enabled it was this light stage technology and being able to do these high fidelity captures of people. And so there are a variety of projects out of ICT, and the Digital Emily project is one that some of you guys might have seen, which was an attempt to do very believable photorealistic digital human generation. And all of this stuff is still relatively recent. It's within the past decade or so, but things have really accelerated in the last few years with a lot of capabilities coming online. So a little bit about this, and you'll see some more of where we're going. I got a chance to build this recently at Clemson, and I had to do it with essentially a fraction of the budget as to what they had for the original one. And so I had to look at a lot of design constraints, the amount of power the device runs on, being able to generate the light and the color conditions at fast enough speed, enough light for taking photos sharp with low ISO and high shutter speeds and so forth, so that people don't move around too quickly and stuff like that. So all this is sort of off the shelf. We we ordered hundreds of these lights, so 364 lights. It came in boxes of boxes, and Shang and I were opening them for weeks, literally, and they were lying all over the floor. And we went with a DMX protocol, which is a concert lighting protocol as a standard, so that we could use more off-the-shelf components. And we got a geodesic structure built by a company called Sonostar, and we assembled all of this. And we started last summer. We finally had all the parts in place and went through and set up the structure on the geodesic. And we wanted a latitude-longitude layout of the lights so we could have a better control. So even though it is a geodesic, the lights are laid out close to latitude and longitude. It's not quite perfect because of the way we mounted it. But we gradually went through, and so along with the DMX protocol, all of this runs back to a 20-port USB hub right now. We have Python and various Python libraries controlling everything. A library called Gphoto to control the cameras, and we have an array of 7 DSLR cameras right now that we can control along with the lights for what we're using the dome for. So the 3 purposes that we have is, one, we're setting up a face capture pipeline that could be used for games or film, very similar to the one that ICT started, so we can do digital human capture, so you'll see a little bit of that in this talk. The 2 additional purposes that we're using our sphere for is capturing and studying materials for physically based rendering, and we have some work going in that. And then lastly, we're using our sphere as a controllable photogrammetry environment. This builds on some work out of Red Storm Ubisoft that I presented here in 2018. And so these guys will go through this. First, Shang is going to talk a little bit about the 3D capture pipeline for faces, and then afterwards, Jess will present some material on materials.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Shang Li. I'm a PhD student working for Dr. Eric Patterson, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to introduce our stereo image capture devices to you guys. And for the past few years, my life kind of evolved with this device. So we built everything from scratch. We mount all the lights together, and we have 7 cameras taking images from different angles of your face. But yes, it's been a decent work so far. So, and besides that, secretly among all the students in our lab, we secretly call this dome as a hamster ball because it looks like a ball for hamster. And yeah, if we ask you to sit in, you can be a hamster man, right? Yeah. Okay. Okay. What do we do with this giant hamster ball? So let me show you a movie clip from The Curious Case of Benjamin Button. Yes, yes. The special visual effects expert needed to put an age-looking Brad Pitt's face onto a child-sized body. So how could we do that? We cannot simply chop off his head and transplant to another actor. So what should we do? What we need Brad Pitt's facial geometry, and how could we quarrel those information? So now this device has come up. The geometry acquisition could be done with this device. So we could ask a person to sit in, and we took images, and we can control each line one by one, so we can measure the materials. Will be the talk from Miss Jessica Barone. But with those pictures from different angles, since the picture was taken from different angles, so we call those images stereo images. So with those images, we can be able to reconstruct the 3D geometry of someone's face. So, and this is one test we initially got from Dr. Patterson, and this was the initial test. So what it can do is you pass through the stereo images to some software like this EdgeSoft, and you can construct 3D image of your 3D geometry of your face. But the other thing is we kind of dig into this paper. This is the original paper from Disney, and the technique it's been used in this paper was the foundation of Disney Medusa facial capture. And in order to be more control on coding or visual effects, we kind of want to build up this algorithm by ourselves. So this image kind of briefly shows the algorithm behind that. So we take image from different angles of one object. We search same location on the object, on those cube and along those like two images. So for example, this this point on the surface will be shown on this image as well as this image. So we shoot a ray from both camera to the pixel of the image, and then use your high school trigonometry. Those two rays will be like meet eventually in the 3D world. So this is kind of the brief algorithm underneath that. So if we have multiple cameras, we could shoot rays on all the pixels and we can construct a really dense 3D objects. So the rest of the work is how could we find those correspondence between different images shown on one surface. So here like those two images, and if you want to reconstruct someone's face, the someone is also Miss Jessica Brown. And if we could figure out a way to find a pixel of nose tip on this image corresponds to the pixel of the nose tip on that image, and then we should raise, we can find the 3D coordinates of object. So again, the question is, how could we find those pairs on those stereo image? We need to find which pixel on the other image is similar to the nose tip on this image. So there's tons of function algorithm we could use to find a similarity. And if we were able to pass those two pixels to some functions like normalized cross correlation, the function returns a higher number if two pixels were similar. So, but how do we find those pairs? We could not just compare this pixel with every other pixel on other image. That will be time complex. So go back to the high school trigonometry, and you can see every 3D point on this ray will be projected on this red line on your right image. So now we could constrain our searching only on those red lines. In computer vision, it's called epipolar line. But now the other question is, how could we find this epipolar line? So it's kind of our life. You solve one problem, the other problem pop out, you solve one, pop out, then you give up. But we could not give up on that, right? And we need to find the epipolar line. So there is another algorithm behind that. You could virtually rotate the image plane. So those two images will line on the same horizontal line. And the best of it is, the best of this algorithm is those epipolar line will line on the same horizontal row in the picture. So if we want to search what's the similar pixel on your left image, you just search the same row on the other image. So now the rest of the thing is you cast a ray from those two images, you meet those rays into a 3D word space, you can construct a face. So, and here's the example that we took last week of one of our DP students, and I did the camera calibration and rectification. You can see those two images are lining properly. For example, the corner of the mouse is on the same horizontal line on the other image. Okay. But just have 3D point is not enough at all. And you cannot use those point cloud to do the animations or rigging for the game production. So what I mean by that is you need after you got the point cloud, you need a common mesh onto this point cloud. This main mesh has less point cloud, but it's more flexible. You can do the animation on that. So, a common mesh is that we will ask like an artist or some anthropologist to create this main mesh, And this mesh is obviously way less points than 3D point cloud. But a good common mesh normally follow an autonomy of human's face, where's the muscle movement, and where's your muscle, something like that. And with this common mesh, you can walk those common mesh on the 3D point cloud. But previously, what we would do is ask artists to labelly tile those mesh on the point cloud. But it involves lots of works. So, but luckily we have tons of research going on which can help you to automatically warp the common mesh over point cloud. So this is, we use a common mesh warp onto Dr. Patterson's face, and the warping software we use is called Warp 3D. And with retopologized face, we are able to do animation, and we don't have to actually chop off Brad Pitt's head and put it on the other actor's body. And what else we could do with retopologized face? Sometimes facial data are really sensitive, and it's really hard to get. And because not all the lab has a device like we were built. And also if you buy those facial data online, it's super expensive. So could we figure out a way we can use less data we have and augment the data set? So the answer to that question is yes. So there's kind of like a statistical model we could use. What it does is within a data set, we know the location of each point on the mesh. For example, the nose tip of this guy is at here. And the nose tip of this lady is at here. If we were able to interpolate some points in the middle, we create a new position of nose tip. So if we were able to interpolate every point on that mesh in a data set, we could create a new face. And in computer graphics, the algorithm to find those point in a data set is called a PCA, principal component analysis, but I'm not going to the mass detail. And here is the software we had in our lab, which ran PCA over only 48 mesh. But you could see by sliding those R, you could create face in a small data set. And also we could run the PCA over texture map, so we can create a different color scheme. But how could we use this technique in the production, especially in game industry? So here is the example. Early this year, Epic Game released Unreal 5 and its MetaHuman. With the MetaHuman, you could make your own game avatar for your game design or production. By the way, meta is kind of a buzz topic this day. Every fancy word starts with meta, meta coin, meta company, MetaHuman, metaverse. Come on, big companies, be more creative. You're better than that, okay? And anyway, how did they do that? I don't know the exact algorithm they ran to create the MetaHumans, but I'm pretty sure they run PCA on a larger data set than more than 48. And their data set has a wider range of age, ethnicities, and skin color. So you could create this. So is geometry enough? The answer is no. If you only have geometry, you pass it to rendering engine, you got is monocolor geometry. But in production, we have those images called maps to shade the color on image. For example, the diffuse map gives the base color. You need the normal map to get orientation of the face on the geometry. Specular map, you have a specular mirror reflections, etc. So if you have those maps, you pass them to the rendering engine, you could render out the photorealistic images. But normally, in game industrial, the modeler will be asked to create those maps in some tool, like a Substance Painter, Substance Designer. Those maps are fake, right? Could we use our device to capture those maps automatically? The answer is yes as well. So this will lead to Miss Jessica Brown's talk.
Yeah, so this is just a quick highlight from work in progress from getting our multi-camera capture array going in just the last couple weeks. This is a more detailed version from the scan over on the right, from 7 cameras synchronously capturing within the dome, and then using WRAP, which is the software tool that does the retopology correspondence. It works really well for faces and hands and bodies and other things like that if you guys need software for that, and it has automated setups for sequences and facial expressions and whatnot. And then the maps on the right, the center part of my face is generated from captures from the dome from different lighting conditions. You'll see a little bit more in Jessica's part of the talk. And then those can get applied for rendering, and this is just a quick example in progress of doing a rendering off of the data out of the dome. And this is in that nice quad mesh, so we could set up blend shapes, facial rigging, and so forth, put it in an engine and all that sort of thing. And what we would like to do down the road is to do more facial captures, get these in, have a pipeline for collecting a lot of data, a lot of different types of faces, and build realism, using it both for production and for research projects. We have some other tools that we've worked on for automating retopology and doing expression captures and things like that that we're kind of all gradually bringing together. So that's the next part, which is on materials. So we'll welcome Jessica.
So I'll be covering material capture in general with the dome, and I'll first discuss what are materials, and in particular this underlying map of BSDF. And materials in general are surface appearances. The BSDF is a map that describes how light interacts with surfaces. So here's some examples of materials in the real world from my home. And a lot of them are really unique due to this texture-like spatial variation on them. But firstly, kind of ignoring that variation, try to identify some underlying properties. And some main distinctions are whether a material is metallic or dielectric, transparent versus opaque, or something in between. Like up here is a dog tongue, so that's something in between with subsurface scattering. Or if the material is rough versus smooth. So the BSDF, that math part, is called a bidirectional scattering distribution function, and that provides a ratio of the incoming light hitting a surface to the light that's scattered away from that surface. And typically that's computed per red, green, and blue channels. And scattering refers to both reflection off of the surface, so like a sharp specular highlight, or transmission through the surface. And the primarily used BSDF is called microfacet theory, and this comes out of optics, and this has led to today's physically based rendering workflows. And that's an idea that surfaces have statistically arranged microfacets. So the polygonal geometry you have in a scene actually has these fake little small surfaces on top of it. So here's a diagram showing what that BSDF function models. So we have some incoming light, and it's in respect to the microsurface described by the normal, and the orange and pink blobs represent the probabilities of where the light could scatter off of the surface once hitting it. So the orange ones would be reflection off of the surface. The sharp peak would be like a bright white highlight, like a specular reflection. And then the wider one would be a more diffuse response, probably whatever base color the surface is. And it could have the same sort of response through the other side of the surface for transmission. And here's a different sort of plot. So this is from the lab I was a part of in Switzerland, where they measure some materials. And here I just want to show their plots to show for the highly specular material. There's a plot that might be tricky to see. It has a really sharp peak, and that indicates a strong correlation between the lighting and viewing directions, and that's why we see these mirrored appearances on the renders. Where in comparison with this diffuse material, it has this wider response that's a little bit less dependent on the viewing and lighting directions. So how does this relate to games? So this equation is called the rendering equation, and for physically based rendering and shading, there's some sort of approximation set up in whatever system you're using. And one part of it is the BSDF. That's this F, and it's inside an integral or a summation, so it's called many, many times whenever we're calculating light interactions with surfaces to get some final colors and pixels. So for games, it's typically implemented in parallelized shader code because it needs to be fast. And we could create a wide range of appearances based on textures. Like in my real-world material examples, there were a lot of different details according to where you were in that image. Here's a little related work on physically based shading, PBS, and the BSDF models in games. And all of it right now relates back to this Disney principled shader, which was proposed by Brent Burley at SIGGRAPH in 2012, and then there was an expansion in 2015. And he looked at some real-world measurements of materials and came up with a way of choosing 10 or so intuitive parameters for artists to use to create a wide variety of looks. And he came up with a tool for helping visualize the BSDFs too in developing his new shader. A year later, Brian Karras at Epic Games adapted the Disney shader for Unreal Engine, and the Unreal Engine material layering and editing is based off of this. Then a year after that, EA Games also adopted the Disney shader for their Frostbite engine. I also talked with the lead graphics engineer at Naughty Dog. They use the Disney shader, and Substance Designer and Painter is based on it too. So if you've used it, you might have even seen the name Disney as an export option. And a really useful guide, this PBR guide I have noted under algorithmic, is a good introduction to physically based rendering and shading. Here's a little bit on the Disney shader. So the figure on the left is the BRDF model, so the reflection only one, which had 10 parameters for creating metallic or dielectric looks, rough versus smooth, but it's all on one underlying model. And then that was expanded to support transmission, and I'm very familiar with that figure because I implemented that for Pixar, and that included an interactive version. So it wasn't quite real-time rendering, so not exactly ready for games, because transmission and particularly refraction through glass is an expensive calculation, so that's tricky to get fast enough for games. So there are a lot of tricks done in the industry right now, but it's not quite physically based. The red blob is another BRDF plot, so similar to the diagrams I showed before, and that's out of the Disney BRDF Explorer, where the central blobby portion is more of a diffuse response from a material, and the sharp spike coming off of it is a strong specular peak. And it's kind of like this ball from the PBR guide, where the specular highlight would be that peak from the plot. I have these figures from the PBR guide just to go back to the idea of microfacet theory, that the smooth surface of the sphere is actually based on these imaginary little microfacets, those bumps. And the layout of those bumps is driven by a parameter like roughness. So on the left figure, you see a lot of the outgoing directions are in that mirrored direction about the surface normal. So that would be a smooth surface where most of the outgoing light gives a mirror-like response. Whereas if the surface is rough, then there's a little bit more randomness to where the light is exiting. that's a little bit of background on what materials and VSDFs are. So now I'll talk about what we want to do with measuring them. And there are a lot of different approaches, and in our case, we're interested in acquiring spatially varying maps. So we've already discussed text maps a little bit for faces. There's the same sort of idea going on with the pictures below, with getting a diffuse and normal map out of the bark. But in general, for any sort of measurement, we have an object we want to measure, and a way of actually holding it. Like it should be stable and still. And some sensor. In our case, we're using cameras, but there could be other devices like spectrometers measuring particular wavelengths and intensities, and highly controllable lighting. So one very significant work in material studies for graphics is the Merle database, where they measured reflectance models from actually spheres of materials. And that was a trick they used to get a bunch of different angles with one image. We'll talk more about that later. So for what we want to do, that's a little bit limited because the materials aren't spatially varying. Like with the faces, we have a lot of different information across the face for the normals and diffuse and specular. And right now, for this sort of capture, we're using a small number of images to produce those maps. And then those are some rendering examples using those maps in the top right corner. But for a more general material capture, typically we'll want to take images with one light at a time for our dome. And that's tricky because there are physical limitations in setting up the lights from like fine increments around the dome for a bunch of different incident lighting angles, and we also want to change the viewing angles too, because we could see on any material there could be a different sort of response to light depending on the viewing and lighting directions. So that's why we're interested in one light at a time, and also changing the viewing directions. And because of all those different directions, it might take a while to actually do a full capture. So the object should be mounted stably, and that's really difficult for a human. And in my case, I'm looking at feathers a lot, so we'll see a lot of feathers upcoming. And the data could accumulate really quickly too with doing a one light at a time capture. And a simulated scene like this one that I've been working on could help with planning to do a detailed VSDF capture. This is also a way to see the dome without like all the wires attached, so you can see the general underlying structure shape. And we generally have the light set up latitude and longitudinal arrangement. A little video so you can see this in motion, where we're synchronizing some camera captures with changing the lights too, and that internal holder could rotate to change the viewing direction. So changing the object will also be changing the viewing direction with the still camera. And we're taking raw images that are 6,000 by 4,000 resolution. We quickly get a lot of data. Here's a close-up of that internal setup with that rotating device and updating the virtual scene to match the real world a bit more. Okay, so with our approach in particular, advantages are that it's super bright, so whatever's inside is illuminated really well, and we have the high control over the lighting. In this thing inside, we're calling the universal stage. Since it can rotate and we can produce a lot of different viewing directions, and that's what we need for a detailed material capture, and trying to do basically all the possible direction combinations on that whole sphere. And we do have synchronized camera captures too. Disadvantages of our approach are that the capture period is long. Imagine putting on one light at a time takes a while. And people could walk by and maybe disrupt, so I made that sign. lights do have a decent arrangement in latitude and longitude. It's not perfect due to physical constraints though. For our dome, we do need an isolated environment, and then they put up that sign. But also the lights should be off during capture, so the only light sources are our dome. We also have some polarization set up too. So I have filters over every single light source where we don't want like the fluorescence on the ceiling on at all. Also, the device is a little tricky to maintain, but overall, this is a fun tool to work with and help build up as a useful resource in terms of hardware and software that we use for a variety of projects. Okay, discuss a little bit about some preparation for collecting data and some post-processing of that data. And one consideration is capturing high dynamic range images. So we have to choose, first of all, some exposure bracketing, where the lowest exposures, so like the leftmost image, should still have some information about the reflectance, so that it might be hard to tell here, but there are little glints showing up on the fluffy part of the feather. And the highest exposure should still have information too, like there's actually useful color information and still some glints showing up where I highlighted it. And those images get combined into a high dynamic range image, typically in the EXR format. And the values of the RGB channels in those images are at a wide range, so something with a lot more useful information than just the typical 0 to 255 range for RGB. And that's really useful for material capture because it's reflecting what happens in the real world with light bouncing off of the surface. So a few notes on color. Actually related to having a high dynamic range image, that information gets used for the SDF data and is related to the real world based on some intensity measurements I have of our light sources. So we got a spectrometer to measure in some real world units the intensities of the red, green, blue, and white LEDs of our light sources. So that was something we've done before any captures. Concerning color during captures too, we could control the lighting. So here I'm not having just white lights, but we could also set up environment image-based lighting if we want. And another aspect concerning color after captures is just being aware of the image formats and not to accidentally introduce any tone mapping because we have the high dynamic range images. That's not something you could necessarily see right away. So like those images have to be tone mapped in order to visualize them at all. And when doing any image processing, might accidentally be converting to a format that I don't want. So it's just something you have to be aware of to keep the data basically as raw and as useful as possible, but progressed. So I'll talk about how I take some information from the images to represent them as BSDFs. So my first test is on a color chart, where again we're taking images at a very high resolution, but we could throw away some information right away, meaning the pixels that aren't on our object. And for my first test, I'm reducing that even further, where I'm focusing on one of the purple tiles. So I got a one light at a time image set, and made HDR images out of the multiple exposed images. And I got an average value of that purple tile for a bunch of different lighting viewing direction combinations. And that sort of idea too of choosing an area of samples, in my case one tile, is important for compressing the data versus keeping all those really high res images. So working with that, I was doing some plotting in 2D and 3D. So like on the left side was one of my 2D plots, just showing the color values I was writing out or saving based on some angles. And wherever it looks the most purple on those plots is where that purple tile is the most lit. So it's most visible. Where it was black would be like when a light was actually behind the color chart and it showed up as black. doing some sort of plots like that, I converted the data I was getting, so those some RGB values for particular lighting and viewing directions, converted that to a known BRDF format, actually back to the Merle database that I showed earlier, because once I had it written out to that format, since it's used by other people, I was able to load it into the Disney BRDF Explorer, which was developed when the Disney Principled Shader came out. So here I wanted to see a diffuse purple material, and I got that out of it. So that was a good initial test. So where is this going? Now you already saw some feathers, and that is my focus. We have an NSF grant on understanding the appearance of feathers. So we're doing a detailed material study on them, like in parallel with building up this whole dome system. These feathers exhibit a wide range of appearances, and it warrants some more investigation and help categorize them. And I hope to have a real-time visualization of what we observe from feather light scattering. And we do have a macro rail too, so we'll be taking some macro photography of feathers and want to stick that onto the dome. So another gadget to make it more crazy. So it's just a few different things on feathers that I've already looked at, because it's been focusing on understanding their microstructures. As you can see with the actual macroscopic image there. So that's what I have on materials. Want to wrap up?
Great. Yeah. So just a last little bit on the third part here. It's been less of our focus so far. So much of what I'll show you on the third application for photogrammetry kind of builds back to the work that I was doing with Ruben Henrez at Red Storm a few years ago. So when you have a controlled lighting environment like this, you can create a very ambient type lighting condition because you have uniform light from around the sphere. And then in addition to that, I don't know if you guys made it to Amber's talk this morning on cross-polarization, but we have the latitude and longitude of the lights polarized differently. So one set is horizontally polarized and one set is vertically polarized. And then we have the camera lenses polarized, so we can either have matched polarization or cross-polarization. And what happens there is reflected light keeps that polarity, whereas diffuse light enters an object and then comes out with random polarity. So with those two different conditions, you can either accentuate the specular highlights or almost completely remove them. And so if you were to go back, for instance, and look at the maps here that Jess showed, the normal maps are actually calculated by 3 different light gradient conditions in the dome. The specular map is calculated using that cross-polarization technique. And then the diffuse map is essentially the base color, the albedo. Those are done with the cross-polarization techniques. The specular is the specular highlight minus the diffuse albedo. So we can calculate all of those out of the sphere with that setup. So along with that, so this is just giving a little bit of credit to the tech art team where I was at Red Storm. We were doing a lot of work, and some of this went into the Division 2. They used a lot of photogrammetry on that pipeline. But one of the things we wanted to do was compare creation of an asset in sort of the traditional digital pipeline versus a photogrammetry pipeline. And so Nick Georgopoulos, I think he recently left Red Storm for Praxis. He created this model that you see there. And Ruben and I worked on a hemisphere version, which is sort of the earlier version of what you're seeing our sphere here today. And we created an automated turntable, and all of this is controlled very similarly to our current sphere, except at the time we were using .NET and Windows Foundation code, and all of our stuff is Python. But what we were able to do is control with our software, rotating the turntable to essentially generate perfect photogrammetry conditions with our lighting and positioning. And we also set in focus racking with the software to focus across the depth so that we don't have to worry about a thin depth of field, and we can keep all of the images in focus for the photogrammetry construction. And we were able to, on this setup, you're seeing a glimpse of 2,700 photos that we automated. We press the button, we walk out of the room and come back 2 hours later, and all the photos are shot in different rotations of the device, different focus stacking, and we feed that in, and we can get just superb quality out of the photogrammetry reconstruction. It just blows anything manual out of the water. And so as you see this rotate, I forget the poly count on this, but it's pretty insane. And then you'll see just the base color texture map come in. Now, this is off of our earlier version. What we'll be able to do eventually is combine all of this too, so we'll be able to take the normal map, diffuse and specular separation, all of those lighting conditions, and do it at the same time as doing the photogrammetry. So we'll be able to have diffuse, specular, and very high detail normal maps off of anything that we do a photogrammetric reconstruction on in the sphere. So that's kind of where we're headed on all of this. And just as a quick blurb, I also want to give a glimpse of our graduate program. We have a variety of graduate programs. We do MS and PhD in computer science with an emphasis in visual computing. And we also have a digital production arts degree, which is very industry focused, where we do film, visual effects, and animation, game development, VR, augmented reality, and other things like that. And our students often land some highly coveted positions at all of the big studios. So if you guys have interest in that, we're always looking for good people for programs. And we have several other people who didn't join us today, but a lot of people contributed to this light sphere project along the way. So that's the end of our talk. Any questions for any of us?
So this is going to become a serious question, a little bit of a joke. You're examining things like feathers and things like micro details. The topology that you showed, I saw a lot of skin details. I understand you're looking at more micro details and substance together. How difficult would it be to do the examinations on hair in the light sphere, and how long will it be until you try to put an actual hamster in your hamster?
I love the hamster question. That's great. That's going to inspire some future work. The hair thing actually falls in line with some of the work that Jessica and I in particular are doing, because feathers have substructures, barbs and barbules, that are on the order of the diameter of hairs and even smaller. And so there's been a little bit of work in computer graphics research on illuminating hair from a certain angle and then trying to sense the reflection off of it. So that micro photo rail that Jess referred to is something that we're hoping to integrate. We have a focus rail, which will be another robotically controlled thing within the sphere, where we'll be able to focus down to the micron level and move forward and focus that while illuminating from different angles. So we very conceivably could study hair illumination further down the road, hopefully. And hamster hair too, or fur. Zach?
So I think you alluded to this, but temporal capture, so speed is always an issue. What are you guys thinking on that?
Yes, so that's a very good question. Temporal capture, so for instance, facial expressions and the way your tissue moves with nonlinear dynamics as you pose a facial expression are particularly useful for digital human capture. Right now, we're somewhat constrained. The DMX standard can only change the speed of the lights to about a 44th of a second. And we've tested that, and that seems pretty accurate based on the spec. Our cameras, the still camera is much slower than that. It's only 5 frames per second. But we can do video capture with these. And right now, you could multiplex those 5 lighting conditions relatively quickly. So if you did each of those at a 40th of a second, then you'd be up to 5/40th of a second. which would be a 20th of a second, which is almost a film frame rate. But what you can maybe do is do that every other frame or stack it and then interpolate in between. So we haven't done it yet. There's definitely some work to test, but the goal would be down the road to be able to do temporal capture. And then optical flow and wrap type techniques to align the different facial expressions with the same mesh.
I'm using optical flow right now for the facial captures. So even if it's like a second between captures, people still move a couple millimeters.
Yeah, people are the trickiest, and we don't really have a good setup in there yet to help the people stay still. So there's a fair amount of head movement just in a quick picture taking. But that technique, optical flow that Jess mentioned, looks at all the pixels and how they move and tries to get the best alignment between images. Other questions? Yes.
Just out of curiosity, people like to be but like, how complicated or is it for the eye to roughly point?
Eyes are pretty interesting because of the specularity, and that's a tricky area to capture. This would not be the ideal sort of setup for doing that. There's been one research paper that came out of ICT on eye capture specifically, and it's a little bit Clockwork Orange. They put someone in a device and they kind of hold their eyes open, and then they shove a DSLR right up on their eyes with a macro lens and photograph it. So you can get some pretty good captures that way, but it would probably be a separate apparatus than this. We get some geometry, but it's really pretty sloppy off of photogrammetry because of the glossiness of the eyes. The DoD actually has some really interesting stuff. Years ago, a decade or so ago, we were working with some people and they were doing infrared-based capture in the wild at a distance of people at airports to try to grab their iris patterns as they're walking. So there's some crazy stuff out there, but it would probably be a little bit different setup.
I have a couple notes on experience so far with doing face captures concerning the eyes. It's really bright, so people want to have their eyes closed in there. So that's why in these images we showed today, our eyes closed. We did do a couple with eyes open too, and the diffuse versus specular, or the polarized versus cross-polarized images are pretty revealing in the specular reflection on the eyes. So when the specularity is allowed to go through, then we have like bug eyes because they're just white dots all over the orbs of our eyes. That looks a bit creepy, but I think the color is showing up really well on our diffuse ones though.
Yeah, it might be interesting to combine that with the macro rail or something somehow.
Yeah.
Other questions? Yes?
Alright, so after you do the capture using a light sphere, what software do you bring it into?
Okay, so we showed kind of two options we're working on. The full captures that we showed of my face and Jess's face, those were out of Agisoft Metashape. If you don't want to have an NVIDIA card, that's your best option out there. And it's really probably the best competitor to reality capture. And they recoded it totally about 2 years ago, so it's a really good competitor. You'll hear people say, oh, reality capture is better, but they're both pretty comparable these days. The other option we're working on is building a version of Davo Beeler from Disney Research's Medusa system, which is the stereo reconstruction that Sean was talking about. So there are a few different options. After you get the mesh out of either one of those, it's a really dense, crazy point cloud, and then you can make a mesh out of it with a mesh stitching. And then you can re-topo it a variety of ways. You can manually do your own topology in ZBrush or Maya or 3D Coat or TopoGun or a few others. But if you're doing faces, wrap is really probably the way to go because you can set up landmarks like the corners of eyes. And if you have a good template mesh already, then you can set up those landmarks between your scan and the template mesh, and it will go through and use an algorithm called iterative closest point and get your nice, clean quad topology to match your scan. So you have the shape in a really good format. Other questions? Yes, Stephen?
So I kind of fell off a bit on the materials talk. I was curious, so it looks like you're
Yeah, so that's a good question. You mentioned material mass. We did sort of show two techniques here. Because people move very quickly, you don't often do the one light at a time, which you would need for a full material reconstruction, because what you're trying to do with that BSDF is say, if you're viewing it from here, how does the light from any angle get reflected to here? So with faces, you sort of shortcut it. You can do a 4 gradient pattern to get the normal map. You can do a few more gradients to estimate roughness, and then you can do 2 light conditions to get the diffuse and specular. So with 5 photos, you can get a pretty good set of maps for a face. But for material, we really do, particularly for feathers, we want to go through and light it from every angle and view it from every angle and see how it responds. So on the precise material capture, that's sort of a whole nother level up, because you do want to do the high dynamic range exposure latitude, and you have to calibrate to make sure you're looking at the same point on the feather, and then put all of that together. So as Jess mentioned, it's very data intensive. We're getting these 24 megapixel, no optical, low pass filter images for 5 or 6 different exposure brackets, for all these different viewing angles, and then having to extract the data from it. So it's a lot of sort of code going on, even past the capture code stuff.
Because we have a lot of parallel efforts right now.
Yeah.
So
That-
follow up with that. So what options are out there, maybe even like non-visible light, for gauging the penetration of light into a surface, subsurface scattering?
Gotcha. So the interesting thing, particularly about skin, but this is true of other surfaces too, is the wavelength of the light will have a different reaction. So for skin, because of the hemoglobin, red tends to penetrate and bounce around and come back out. And so red light actually has a softer interaction. That's where we get most of our glow from skin and that subsurface scattering. So you can actually do some relatively simple techniques, like if you go and look at the red response versus the green versus the blue, just off of a digital camera, the blue normal map estimation will be much more precise, where you see all the little pores, and the red will be a softer response. So one neat little hack that works really well for games anyway, for real-time rendering, is you can use a red channel normal map and a green channel normal map and a blue channel normal map, as opposed to just one normal map for everything. And just doing that 3 separate passes in the rendering gets you a pretty cheap subsurface scattering in real time, which is a cool technique. But yeah, there's some other studies on using different wavelengths of light for whether they reflect or penetrate the skin or other surfaces more deeply. So definitely an option. And that's one of the reasons why we want these spectral capabilities with red, green, blue, and white. We had looked at trying to get amber, white, red, green, blue, and ultraviolet, but that was starting to blow the budget at that point. And by the way, the budget on this, if you're curious, was about 20 grand. So it's not set up in your garage very easily sort of project, but yeah. Other questions? Prescott?
Hang on, budgeting. What is the price of electricity?
Fortunately, because these are LEDs, it's actually not too bad, but we do have to have this on at least 3 separate breakers.
And I've tripped it a lot.
Yeah. We've tripped it trying, because our wiring diagram for our studio was not as accurate as we wanted it to be. So we've sort of had to feel out which wall outlet is actually on a different breaker back in the power room. So we have 4 different extension cords right now going out to different breakers.
I guess, I was just going to say, since we're talking about all the mechanics, what were the DSLR cameras?
Sure. So this is sort of the best bang for the buck. And these things are actually kind of hard to find right now. The price has gone up since 2 years ago when I bought the 8 that we had. It's a Nikon D3500. So the body was originally only $450, but they're $650 now. And then we have 85mm lenses on them, which makes the framing about like this when you put them 4 feet away outside of the sphere. The nifty thing about those particular cameras is it's a recent Nikon sensor, so really good sensitivity and whatnot on the photo sites. And there's no optical low pass filter which mildly blurs your image, which most cameras have. There are only 4 or 5 cameras out on all of the market that doesn't have that. And we want really precise material and photogrammetry reconstruction, so we were looking for a camera without that. Prescott?
How do you, I guess, what are the bad images that you get out and how do you account for those so they don't get factored in?
Bad images, say for photogrammetry, or?
Yeah, like if some of them didn't turn out correctly, like how do you make sure those don't get incorporated?
Gotcha. Right now, that's really part of our work in progress. We're trying to make it so we don't get bad images. So we've been testing, what exposure ranges will work with the amount of light that we put out. And because we do have the polarizers, that cuts the amount of light. But we want to have a low ISO, so we have low noise. We want to have a fast shutter speed, so if a person's in there, it's not going to blur. And then for the materials, we need to exposure bracket. And what is that range? Because a highlight might be thousands of times brighter than the rest of the surface material. And you can't clip that highlight or you lose the information. So right now we're basically trying to go through testing empirically to sort of eliminate any bad images that we might get.
I have a couple of notes on there.
Yeah, go ahead.
Points too. We got a lot of images out of focus, so Sean was working on a GUI for doing some interactive, like camera live views and focusing, but for the most part, we're manually focusing in the center of the sphere and asking someone to shift into that center. But still, sometimes there might be some viewpoints that are a little bit out of focus, and that can make the photogrammetry a little weaker. And also notice when doing the photogrammetry on the faces, having the light sources in the background will totally throw it off. So I had to write some code to crop out the face.
Yeah, and, 2 more things on that. If you decrease the size of your aperture, which is a larger f number, then you get a deeper depth of field, which is much better for photogrammetry. So by trying to get the light as bright as we can, it's a little painful for the person, but it lets us shoot with a sharper and increased depth of focus for better images. And then one of the things we had in Red Storm at our interface that we put on our software there was the ability to focus rack within the software, and we're hoping to eventually add this down the road too, so that we can get that very quickly from the machine rather than going around to every little camera and tweaking it. I heard a number once, I don't know if it's still accurate, but the digital human type capture for feature films sessions at ICT starts at around 30 grand. So they bring in one of the bigwig actors for a new film or whatever, they sit them down for a couple hours and do all of the captures like for Benjamin Button, and it's quite expensive. But you want to get that stuff dialed in before you do that. Any other questions? Zach? Yeah. Yes, so ideally we're going to try to do everything markerless, although we may have some tracking markers ultimately for the material carrier in the universal stage to help us with the calibration spatially of the orientation of the material. But for faces, we're going to try to do everything markerlessly if we can. Prescott?
So there's a basically an open source project that someone's working on where people would post a picture of like the sky and it would put together the like overall picture that you get. I was just wondering if that's the same concept of the heavy polar line, just putting images together and trying to draw.
There are some overlaps there because a basic computer vision concept is what's called a homography. What is this point in this one photo? Is it the same point in this photo? And photo stitching, like if you use, I'm gonna blank on the software now, but if you do photo stitching or do it on an app on your phone or anything, it's looking for those common points. and then it uses them to calculate how the photo stitches together. So there is a commonality there with the multi-view stereo. You're finding the common points to estimate the camera positions, projections, orientations, and then you rectify to get that epipolar line to search along it. Then you create the point cloud, and then go to the mesh and so on. Troy?
Yeah, I was wondering the epipolar line thing, if the original rotation of those points the picture is taken on, if that has to get refactored into that calculation later, or just the direction of the rays is the thing that matters?
Well, I mean, it's both, because the cameras have to see a sizable amount of overlap, and then you have to estimate the camera positions and orientations of their viewing pyramid. And then once you get that, you know that, well, this pixel you're looking through is a ray out in space. So when this camera over here is looking at it, the point that matches has to be along that line, and that's kind of where that comes from. Other questions? All right, well, thanks everybody. If there's anything else you're interested about, feel free to hit us up later.